past 18 months has been extremely interesting in watching the demands for labor across the various provinces of the country. And the demand for low-skilled labor in the western provinces to support the resource boom has been phenomenal. And we've been meeting that largely through temporary flows. At the same time, as I just mentioned, we have high levels of poverty for immigrants in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver who have lower skills. They are generally mostly working in part-time jobs, but they're not mobile. And so they're not able, or probably they're not able, to move to Western Canada to take up these relatively high-paying jobs. I would caution, though, that the wage rates in Western Canada are very high, but the cost of living is also very high. So the net may not get you a lot further ahead. How do we balance the desire of smaller provinces or rural areas to maintain their population base when most immigrants want to go to large urban centers? And these large urban centers are often smaller than the urban centers that they came from. That's something that we often forget. Immigrants coming from China a lot of times come from cities that are larger than our largest city that we haven't even heard the name of if we're not from China. And so what would entice them to go to a smaller center? I talked to an immigrant from China who said she thought Ottawa was pretty small. It is pretty small, but in Canadian context, it's not that small. So how do we balance these needs? Some provinces, we just looked recently at some demographic projections, some provinces are going to have a very difficult time maintaining their labor force over the next 10 or 15 years. They will see a decline in the absolute level of their labor force unless they're able to retain more immigrants, and even then that might not be enough. So provinces like New Brunswick and Newfoundland are going to have real challenges, as may Saskatchewan. And I might have said, I didn't think that was the case 6 months ago, but now that oil prices are below $50 again, or at least they were the last time I looked, Saskatchewan may continue to have challenges. And part of that is about attracting immigrants to smaller centers, because most people, when they come to Canada, they know Toronto. Well, they know the word Toronto. Toronto's a big city. If you don't know anything, you're more likely to go to a city where the possibility of finding a job is greater just because there's a greater mass. But you may not know that there are opportunities in other provinces. Manitoba has been very successful in attracting immigrants to its province for quite a few years now. They have a very targeted recruitment program. It recognizes that the ethnic community is important to keep people, and they've done quite well. But at the same time, for immigrants to go anywhere outside of the urban center, having a job is probably one of the most important things. So and I think for Canadian-born, you're less likely to decide that you want to move to, if I say something, I don't want to be accused of picking on a certain town, but you're less likely to decide you want to go to Barrie, Ontario, if you don't know anything about it and you don't have a job than if you actually have a job. So I think that immigrant motivations are not different from those of Canadians. You've probably all heard that in a short period of time, all net labor force growth nationally will come from immigration, so within less than a decade. And the minister asked me exactly which year, and there is no precise year, but because it's a forecast, there's a range, and I think it may be later if there's less retirement because of the current economic situation than it would have been last year, but it's probably somewhere around 2012 to 2016 in that area. And that's because the number of people retiring from the labor force in Canada will be greater than the number of new entrants from Canadian education systems. So that places some demand on immigration to meet anticipated needs and to maintain our labor force growth. But at the same time, the current economic situation is going to raise some other issues related to that. And so do we look at the longer term or the short term, and how do we balance those two potentially conflicting situations? Another, and this is probably, I have social integration down there, and it's in quotes for a reason. It's maybe not a policy concern as much as a puzzle. We're always struggling with what we mean by social integration. What is social and what is integration? And I don't think that we've been very successful in identifying clear objectives in defining it and understanding what it means. And when people discuss that, and they often come to me and say, you know, Liz, we'd like you to do some more work on social integration, because we do a lot of work on economic. And I say, okay, what would you like me to do? Well, you know, like social. Okay. The other reason is that it's difficult, and not to say that it isn't important. And the acceptance of immigrants, the integration, we have a desire, we talk about a two-way street. I'm not sure that we quite have the two-way street, and I'm not sure that both groups are moving at the same speed in directions that will converge. But I would argue that we don't really have clear objectives for Canadian-born in terms of social integration, civic participation, involvement in community. You know, do you use your parks? Somebody said, oh, I think immigrants should use parks. And I said, okay, but should I use the park? No. Well, what about religious, going to church or to a temple or to some place of worship? So we went through this list, and I decided that I was certainly not integrated in any way because I didn't do any of those things. So often we're struggling to say, what is it that we're trying to get at? What are we trying to do on social integration? I think personally that removing barriers is the most important thing. And then if we want to encourage more people to vote, we want to encourage more people to vote, not just immigrants. And we can develop policies in that regard. But that's an area that we keep coming back to and we keep coming around on. And all countries are struggling with this, but I think other countries, for example, France may be struggling more because they have more serious challenges in terms of their second generation youth, access to the labor market, access to education, access to citizenship, all of those things. We do have challenges in Canada. I'm not going to say we don't. We have generally a very good program, but there are areas that we are concerned about. And if you have any ideas on what's social and what's integration, that would be great.